Pack your things. This house isn't yours anymore." My daughter-in-law said it so calmly you would have thought she was reminding me about an appointment, not erasing 32 years of my life in a single sentence. I stood there in the middle of the living room, my hands still wrapped around the same porcelain teacup I had been using since my husband and I moved into this house back in 1991. The afternoon light filtered through the curtains just the way it always had, warm and soft, touching the framed photos on the wall. Our wedding day, Daniel as a boy with his gap-toothed smile, Christmas mornings filled with laughter. Nothing in that room had changed. Except me. Except my place in it. I didn't answer her. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at Daniel, though I could feel him standing a few feet behind her, silent, unmoving. That silence said more than anything he could have spoken. It told me he had already chosen his side. It told me this had been decided long before today. I set the teacup down carefully on the side table, aligning it with the edge as if precision still mattered, as if small acts of order could hold my world together. My suitcase was already by the front door. I hadn't packed it. I hadn't needed to. Someone else had done that for me. Neatly. Efficiently. Like I was checking out of a hotel I had overstayed in. Rebecca crossed her arms, watching me with that same polite expression she used at dinner parties. "We'll make sure you're comfortable somewhere appropriate," she added, her tone smooth, almost generous. Somewhere appropriate. Not here. Not in the home I had cleaned, paid for, decorated, and lived in for over 3 decades. I nodded once, because there was nothing else left to do. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No ticking clock, no hum of conversation, no sound of my husband's footsteps coming down the hallway. It had only been 4 days since we buried him. 4 days since I stood beside his grave, holding Daniel's hand while he cried into my shoulder like he used to when he was a child. And now, that same hand wouldn't even reach for mine. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. It was colder than I expected for late October, the kind of chill that settles into your bones and stays there. I slipped it on slowly, taking my time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to still belong somewhere, even if it was only for a few more seconds. I walked to the front door, my heels soft against the hardwood floor I had polished every Sunday for years. Each step echoed louder than it should have. No one followed me. No one stopped me. When I opened the door, the air outside hit my face, sharp and unfamiliar. I stepped out, pulling the door closed behind me with a quiet click. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew what I would see, a house that looked exactly the same, but no longer had a place for me in it. I stood there on the front porch for a moment, my hand resting on the handle of the suitcase. The sky was pale, the trees half bare, leaves scattered across the driveway in shades of gold and brown. It was the kind of afternoon my husband used to love. He would have been out there raking leaves, calling me over to show me something small and ordinary, something I would have pretended not to care about just to hear him explain it anyway. I tightened my grip on the suitcase. Then I walked down the steps. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there in silence. My reflection stared back at me from the rearview mirror, silver hair, tired eyes, a face that looked older than it had just a week ago. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I just started the engine. Because somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the shock, something else had begun to settle in. Something quieter. Something steadier. They thought I was leaving with nothing. They thought I had nowhere to go, no options, no understanding of what had just happened. They were wrong. And by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. I drove for exactly 18 minutes before I realized I had no idea where I was going. The roads were familiar but distant in a way that made everything feel slightly unreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from behind glass. And for a moment, I considered turning back, not because I believed anything would be different, but because routine has a way of pulling you toward what you have always known, even when it no longer belongs to you. But I kept driving, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes fixed ahead, until I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner just off Route 9, a place my husband and I used to stop at on Sunday mornings after church, back when Sundays still meant something, back when I still had a place to return to. I turned off the engine and sat there for a while, listening to the ticking sound. As it cooled, my suitcase resting on the passenger seat like a quiet reminder that I was no longer a visitor anywhere. I was simply passing through. I went inside and chose a booth by the window, the vinyl seat creaking softly as I slid in, And when the waitress came over, she smiled the way people do when they do not know your story. When you were just another customer passing through their day. Coffee, she asked, and I nodded. Because coffee was something simple, something predictable, something that did not require explanation. I wrapped my hands around the mug when she set it down, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, grounding me in something real, something present. I had not eaten since morning, but I did not feel hungry. Hunger requires space, and right now everything inside me felt too full, too crowded with thoughts I had not yet sorted through. I replayed the past 4 days in my mind, not the funeral, not the condolences or the casseroles or the quiet sympathy of neighbors, but the details that had slipped in between, the ones that had seemed small at the time. Rebecca answering questions that were directed at me, Rebecca guiding conversations away whenever finances were mentioned, Rebecca standing just a little too close to the lawyer during the reading of the documents, and Daniel, always Daniel, standing there with his hands in his pockets, nodding, agreeing, never once looking at me long enough for me to understand what he was thinking. I had told myself he was grieving. I had told myself he was overwhelmed, but grief does not erase a lifetime of knowing someone, and I knew my son well enough to recognize avoidance when I saw it. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder they had given me, the one Rebecca had called just paperwork. The edges were still crisp, untouched, because I had not been given the time or the space to look at it properly. Not in that house, not under her watchful eyes. I opened it slowly, the paper sliding against paper with a soft, deliberate sound, and I began to read, line by line, word by word. The language was formal, precise, the kind of language designed to make you feel small if you did not understand it. But I had spent enough years beside my husband while he handled contracts and agreements to recognize when something did not sit right. There were signatures, mine among them, dates that I remembered vaguely, moments when he had asked me to sign something quickly before dinner, moments I had trusted without question because trust had never been something we needed to negotiate. And yet here they were, those same signatures now tied to documents that suggested I had agreed to things I did not remember. Agreeing to. I felt something shift then, not panic, not anger, but clarity, a quiet, steady awareness that settled in my chest like a weight I could finally hold. I took a sip of coffee and let the bitterness linger on my tongue, grounding me again. If they had been so confident, if they had been so certain I would simply walk away without looking, then they had underestimated something important. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back in my purse, my movements slow, deliberate, the kind of movements that come from someone who is no longer reacting, but beginning to think. I looked out the window at the passing cars, at the ordinary rhythm of people moving through their day, and for the first time since I stepped out of that house, I felt something other than loss. I felt direction, faint but unmistakable, and I understood that whatever they had planned, whatever they believed they had secured, it was built on the assumption that I would remain the woman they had just dismissed, the one who would nod, who would leave, who would not ask questions, and they were still operating under that assumption. They were still inside that house, measuring rooms, making calls, speaking about my life as if it had already been concluded, but they had forgotten one thing. I had been paying attention far longer than they realized, and now, finally, I was going to start asking the questions they never expected me to ask. The diner felt smaller as the minutes passed, the quiet hum of conversation around me fading into the background as my thoughts began to arrange themselves into something sharper, more focused. I finished my coffee and asked for another without really tasting the first, because what I needed now was time, not comfort. I pulled the folder back out and turned to the last page, the signature page, the one they had clearly expected me to glance over and accept without question. My name was therein. Neat cursive, unmistakably mine, but the date beside it made me pause. It was from 3 months ago. A Tuesday afternoon I remembered clearly because it had been the day after my husband's last hospital appointment. The day we sat at the kitchen table while he insisted everything was routine, that we were just updating some documents. I remembered how tired he looked, how his hand trembled slightly as he slid the papers toward me, and how I had signed without reading because I trusted him. Because I believed there would always be time later to ask questions, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that memory settle, not as regret, but as context, because regret does not change facts, and facts were what I needed now. I opened my eyes and continued reading, slower this time, paying attention to the phrasing, the clauses, the sections that seemed deliberately dense. And then I saw it. A reference to a trust, not a new one, but an existing structure, one that had been amended, not replaced, and the language suggested that certain assets had been moved, reallocated, protected under conditions that were not fully explained in this document alone. I leaned back slightly, the vinyl seat pressing against my shoulders, and for the first time since I left the house, I felt something close to certainty, not about everything, but about one thing. This was not as simple as they had made it seem. If it were, there would have been no need for this level of detail, no need for layered language and cross-referenced clauses. I reached for my purse again and took out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years: Thomas Avery, my husband's former business partner, and more importantly, the man who had introduced us to the attorney who originally set up our estate planning. I hesitated for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of awareness that this was the point where things would begin to change. Once I made this call, I would no longer be the woman who quietly accepted what was handed to her. I would be asking questions, and questions have a way of unraveling things people prefer to keep intact. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing. Once, twice, 3 times, and then his voice came through, older, slower, but still steady. Hello. I straightened slightly, my voice calm when I spoke. Thomas, this is Margaret Collins. There was a brief pause, and then recognition. Margaret? I am so sorry to hear about your husband. His tone softened, genuine, and for a moment I allowed myself to acknowledge the loss before moving forward. Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that, but I need to ask you something. I kept my words measured, deliberate. Do you remember the trust that was set up for us years ago? The one handled by Mr. Ellison? Another pause, longer this time, as if he was sorting through his memory. Yes, I do. Your husband was very particular about that. He wanted to make sure everything was structured carefully. I felt my grip on the phone tighten slightly. Carefully how? I asked, and I could hear the shift in his breathing, the subtle change that happens when a conversation moves from polite to purposeful. Margaret, he said slowly, that trust was designed to protect you, especially in situations where control of assets might become complicated. Your husband insisted on it. He said it was important that you would never be dependent on anyone else's decisions. I looked down at the folder in front of me, at the signatures, the clauses, the language that now seemed less like a conclusion and more like a piece of something unfinished. Then why does it look like I signed everything away? I asked quietly, and there was no accusation in my voice, only the need for clarity. Thomas exhaled softly. It should not look like that, unless you are only seeing part of the documentation. I felt a stillness settle over me, deeper than before, steadier. I think that is exactly what I am seeing, I replied, and as I ended the call a few minutes later, after arranging to meet him the next morning, I understood something that shifted everything into place. They had not just expected me to leave, they had expected me not to look, not to question, not to connect the pieces that were never meant to stand alone. I closed the folder once more, but this time it felt different in my hands. Not like a document that defined my loss, but like a map, incomplete, yes, but leading somewhere. And for the first time since I walked out of that house, I knew exactly what my next step would be. I checked into a modest hotel just off the interstate that evening, the kind of place with neutral carpeting and soft yellow lighting that tries not to make an impression, and I appreciated that, because I was not looking for comfort, I was looking for space, a place where no one knew my name, where no one expected anything from me. The receptionist handed me a key card and asked how long I would be staying, and I answered honestly, I am not sure yet, because for the first time in many years, my future was not tied to a schedule someone else had set. I carried my suitcase up to the 2nd floor, the hallway quiet except for the distant hum of an ice machine, and when I opened the door to my room, I paused for a moment, taking in the stillness, a bed neatly made, a small desk by the window, a chair that had probably held hundreds of travelers before me, all of them passing through, none of them staying long enough to belong. I placed my suitcase on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, not because I was tired, but because I was thinking. The conversation with Thomas replayed in my mind, his words careful but clear. This had been designed to protect me, not remove me. which meant that what Rebecca and her lawyer had presented was incomplete at best and misleading at worst. I reached for my purse and took out the folder again, laying the documents flat on the desk this time, smoothing each page as if clarity could be pressed into them through patience alone. I read through the sections again, slower, tracing the language with my eyes, noticing how certain references pointed to additional documents, amendments, attachments that were not included in what I had been given. It was like reading a conversation where half the sentences had been removed, leaving only enough to suggest a conclusion, not enough to understand it. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly, the parking lot below lit by a few overhead lamps, cars coming and going, people stepping out, carrying bags, moving with purpose, each of them knowing exactly where they were headed, and I realized that for the first time since I left the house, I did too, not in terms of destination, but in direction. I turned back to the desk and picked up my phone, scrolling to my email, something I had not done in days. There were messages, condolences, offers of help, things I had not had the energy to respond to, but one message stood out, sent 2 weeks ago from an unfamiliar address, subject line simple, regarding your documents. I opened it slowly. The sender identified himself as a junior associate from the firm that had originally handled our estate planning. The message brief, almost hesitant, asking if I had received the updated trust package and if I had any questions about the changes that had been discussed with my husband. I felt a quiet shift inside me as I read those lines again, because I had not received any such package, not then, not now, which meant there were pieces of this process that had been intercepted, redirected, or simply withheld. I sat back down at the desk, my movements deliberate, my thoughts aligning. I replied to the email, keeping my tone measured, asking for a full copy of all documents related to the trust, including any amendments made in the past 6 months. I did not accuse, I did not speculate, I simply asked, because questions, when asked correctly, have a way of revealing more than statements ever could. I set the phone down and folded my hands together, waiting, not with impatience, but with expectation, because now there was a thread, something tangible to follow, and I intended to follow it carefully, thoroughly, without rushing, without revealing more than necessary. They believed they had already concluded this story. They believed I had stepped out of it quietly, but what they did not understand was that I had only just begun to read it properly, and this time, I would not skip a single line. The response came sooner than I expected, a soft chime from my phone breaking the quiet stillness of the room just after 9 in the evening. And for a moment I did not reach for it, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that whatever was in that message would move things forward in a way that could not be undone. I let the sound settle, then picked up the phone and opened the email. The associate had replied with a professionalism that felt almost careful, attaching several documents, and a brief note that read, "Mrs. Collins, please find the full trust package attached, including all amendments executed within the past 6 months. Do not hesitate to reach out if you require clarification." I downloaded the file slowly, watching the progress bar fill, and when they opened, I felt something inside me shift again, not sharply this time, but steadily, like a door unlocking after being closed for too long. The documents were far more extensive than what I had been given at the house. Multiple amendments, detailed schedules of assets, and most importantly, a clear designation of control that did not match the narrative Rebecca and her lawyer had presented. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on the desk, and began to read with intention, not scanning, not reacting, but analyzing, each clause building on the next, each section revealing a structure that had been designed with precision. My husband had not been careless. He had not left things open to interpretation. He had created layers, safeguards, contingencies, and at the center of it all, my name appeared again and again, not as a passive beneficiary, but as the primary authority under specific conditions, conditions that had clearly been met. I paused when I reached a particular section, one that outlined a transfer of temporary management rights in the event of incapacity, a clause that could easily be misunderstood or, more deliberately, misrepresented if presented without its accompanying provisions. I read the following pages carefully, noting how that temporary transfer was explicitly limited, reversible, and subject to oversight that required my direct involvement, oversight that could not legally function without my consent. I sat back in the chair, letting the weight of that realization settle. They had not simply expected me to leave. They had constructed a version of the truth that relied on me not seeing the whole picture, on me accepting a partial explanation as complete. I reached for a pen and began to mark certain sections, not out of habit, but out of clarity, identifying the discrepancies between what I had been told and what was actually written, each mark deliberate, each note precise. This was no longer confusion. This was evidence. I glanced at the time, just past 9:30, and then back at my phone. There was one more call I needed to make. Not because I lacked information, but because I needed confirmation. I dialed Thomas again, knowing he would still be awake, and when he answered, his tone carried a quiet understanding, as if he had been expecting to hear from me. "You received the documents," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I allowed a brief pause before responding. "I did," I said, my voice even. "And they are not what I was shown earlier today." There was a moment of silence on the line, followed by a slow exhale. "I suspected as much," he replied, and I could hear something firm settle into his tone. The same firmness I remembered from years ago when he and my husband would discuss matters that required absolute clarity. "Margaret, based on what you are describing, you still hold primary authority over those assets. Any attempt to bypass that would not stand if challenged." I looked down at the documents again, at my name, repeated, reinforced, protected in language that was anything but accidental. Then they were counting on me not to challenge it, I said quietly, and Thomas did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered. "And they were counting on you not having access to this." I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, because now, the situation was no longer uncertain. It was defined. They had made a move, a calculated one, and they believed it was final. I opened my eyes and straightened slightly, my posture aligning with the clarity I now held. "I will meet you in the morning," I said, and after we ended the call, I gathered the documents into a neat stack, placing them carefully back into the folder. But this time, the folder did not feel like something I had been handed. It felt like something I possessed, something I understood. I turned off the lamp on the desk and sat in the dim light of the room for a moment longer, the quiet no longer empty, but steady, grounded, because the woman who had walked out of that house earlier that day had done so without answers, without direction. But that was no longer the case. Now I had both, and more importantly, I had something they had not accounted for, the willingness to use them. I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day, organizing what needed to be done with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. The room was still dim, the faint outline of the window barely visible against the early morning sky. And for a moment I remained still, listening to the quiet, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath, not heavy, not strained, just present. I sat up slowly and reached for the folder on the nightstand, placing it in my lap as if it were something that required both care and attention, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it now represented, not loss, but leverage. I dressed deliberately, choosing the same navy coat I had worn the day before, not because it was necessary, but because consistency has a way of reinforcing control, and control was something I intended to maintain from this point forward. I left the hotel just after 7, the air crisp, the sky pale blue with the first signs of sunlight breaking through. And as I drove toward the address Thomas had given me, I noticed how different the road felt compared to the night before. Not unfamiliar, not uncertain, just defined. Each turn intentional, each mile measured. I arrived 10 minutes early and remained in the car, watching the building ahead, a modest office with clean lines and large windows. Nothing extravagant, but nothing careless either. The kind of place where details mattered, where things were handled with precision. I stepped inside at exactly 8 o'clock. The receptionist greeted me with a polite nod, and within moments, Thomas appeared from down the hallway, his posture straight, his expression calm but attentive. He extended his hand, and I took it, not as a gesture of comfort, but as acknowledgement. "Margaret," he said, and I nodded once. "Thank you for seeing me," I replied, and he led me into his office, closing the door behind us with a quiet click. The room was simple, organized, a large desk, 2 chairs, shelves lined with files that suggested years of careful work. I placed the folder on the desk and opened it without speaking. sliding the documents toward him. He reviewed them in silence, his eyes moving steadily across the pages, and I watched him, not for reassurance, but for confirmation. When he reached the sections I had marked, he paused slightly, then continued, and after several minutes, he set the papers down and leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You were not given the full documentation," he said plainly, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "I know," I replied, my voice even. "I was given just enough to believe I had no authority." He nodded once, a small, measured movement. "And that was intentional," he said, not as speculation, but as conclusion. I folded my hands in front of me, resting them lightly on the edge of the desk. "What happens if I choose not to accept what they presented?" I asked, and the question was not about possibility. It was about process. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. "Then we proceed based on the actual terms of the trust, which clearly establish you as the primary authority under the current conditions. Any actions taken without your consent can be challenged and, if necessary, reversed." I let those words settle, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to feel the weight of them fully. "And the house?" I asked, not because it was the most important asset, but because it was the one they had used to remove me. Thomas did not hesitate. "The house is included in the trust, and control of it ultimately falls under your authority as well. Any attempt to transfer or sell it without your approval would not be valid." I nodded slowly, the pieces aligning with a clarity that no longer required interpretation. "Then they are already acting on something they do not actually have," I said, and Thomas's response was immediate. "Yes," he confirmed. "And the longer they proceed under that assumption, the more exposed they become." I sat back slightly, my posture relaxed but deliberate, because this was no longer about what had been done to me. It was about what I would do next. "I do not want confrontation," I said calmly. "I want correction." Thomas allowed a brief pause, then inclined his head. "That can be arranged," he said. And as we began to outline the next steps, formal notices, documentation requests, and the process of reasserting control through the proper channels, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not vindication, but alignment, because the situation had shifted from uncertainty to structure, from reaction to intention. And as I left his office later that morning, the folder in my hand felt lighter, not because it held less, but because I understood exactly how to use what it contained. They believed I had already walked away from everything, but what they had not realized was that I had only stepped back far enough to see the entire picture, and now that I could see it clearly, I was ready to move forward. By the time I returned to the hotel, the day had already taken on a different shape, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything now had direction. I placed the folder on the desk again, not out of habit, but as part of a process I was beginning to understand. Each step deliberate, each action connected to the next. I removed my coat and hung it carefully by the door, then sat down and opened my phone, not to scroll, not to distract myself, but to observe, because if they were already acting as though everything belonged to them, then they would not be quiet about it, and they were not. Rebecca had always preferred visibility. Control presented as confidence, and within moments I found what I expected, a post from her account. A photograph of the living room, my living room, staged differently, the furniture slightly rearranged, the lighting adjusted, a caption that read, "Excited for new beginnings," followed by a series of comments from people who did not know the story behind that image. People congratulating her, praising her taste, unaware that what they were looking at was not a beginning, but an assumption. I studied the image for a moment, not with anger, but with attention, noting the details, the placement of objects, the absence of anything that belonged to me. Even the photographs had been replaced. The walls that once held our history now displayed something neutral, something curated, something that suggested ownership without evidence. I set the phone down slowly and folded my hands, letting the silence return, because silence, when used correctly, reveals more than reaction ever could. They were moving forward quickly, too quickly. And that kind of movement usually means one thing. They believed there would be no resistance. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the parking lot. The same steady flow of cars, the same ordinary rhythm. And I realized that while they were busy presenting a version of the future, I was preparing the reality that would interrupt it. I returned to the desk, and opened the folder once more, this time not to read, but to organize, separating the documents into sections. Original trust, amendments, authority clauses, correspondence, each stack aligned, each page placed with intention. This was no longer about understanding. It was about preparation. I reached for a notepad and began to write, not sentences, not thoughts, but points, specific references, dates, names, sections that would need to be addressed, because when the time came, clarity would matter more than emotion. I paused when my phone vibrated again, a call this time, and I already knew who it would be before I looked at the screen. Daniel. I let it ring once, twice, then answered, my voice steady. Hello. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that fills space when someone is unsure how to begin. Mom, he said finally, his tone careful, measured. I wanted to check if you got settled somewhere. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes resting on the neatly organized documents in front of me. I did. I replied, not offering more, because more was not required. He hesitated again, and then continued. Rebecca and I are meeting with the realtor tomorrow, just to explore options. Nothing is finalized. I allowed a small pause, not to create tension, but to acknowledge the statement. I see, I said calmly. And there it was again, that silence, longer this time, heavier, because somewhere in that moment, he was expecting a reaction, an objection, something that would confirm the role they had assigned to me. But I did not give it to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not question his decision. I simply spoke with the same even tone I had used all day. Daniel, I said, and he responded quickly, almost relieved to hear his name. Yes? I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of emotion, but to center the words before I spoke them. Before you make any decisions, I suggest you review all the documents carefully. I said, each word clear, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. There was a pause, followed by a slight shift in his breathing. What do you mean? He asked, and I could hear the first trace of uncertainty, not fear, not yet, but the beginning of it. I opened my eyes and looked at the folder again, at the structure they had underestimated. I mean that not everything is as simple as it may appear. I replied, and I let the sentence stand on its own, without explanation, without elaboration, because explanation would come later, in the right place, at the right time. The silence on the line stretched for a moment longer, and then he said quietly, okay, not agreement, not understanding, just acknowledgement. We ended the call shortly after, and I set the phone down, my hand resting on it for a moment, because that brief conversation had already begun to shift something, not visibly, not publicly, but internally, and that is where change always begins. I returned my attention to the documents, to the notes I had started, and continued writing, each line precise, each reference intentional, because they were still moving forward under the assumption that nothing would stop them. And I was now fully aware that I would not need to stop them loudly. I would only need to place the truth in front of them, and let it do the work they never expected it to do. The next morning unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, not because it was forced, but because every step now had intention behind it. I left the hotel at 8:30, not rushed, not delayed, simply on time. The folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, no longer something I carried out of uncertainty, but something I carried with purpose. I drove past the house without slowing down, not because I was avoiding it, but because there was nothing there for me to revisit. Not yet. The truth I needed was no longer inside those walls. It was already in my hands. I continued toward the bank Thomas had recommended, a branch that had handled several of the trust transactions in the past. The building stood quiet and orderly, the kind of place where systems mattered and records did not disappear. I parked, stepped out, and walked inside. The air cool, the atmosphere structured, everything in its place. I approached the front desk and gave my name, my voice steady, and within minutes I was seated across from a senior account manager, a woman in her early 50s with a calm expression and attentive eyes. I placed the folder on the table and opened it, sliding forward the documents that referenced the trust. I would like to review the current status of all accounts associated with this structure, I said, my tone measured, not demanding, but clear. She nodded, her fingers moving efficiently across her keyboard, verifying details, cross-checking identifiers. and as she worked, I watched quietly, not interrupting, not filling the silence, because silence in a room like this is not empty. It is functional. It allows truth to surface without interference. After a few moments, she looked up, her expression shifting slightly, not alarmed, but more focused. "Mrs. Collins," she said carefully, "there have been recent attempts to initiate changes on some of these accounts." I did not react outwardly. I simply inclined my head slightly, signaling for her to continue. "The requests were flagged for additional verification due to the structure of the trust," she added, and that detail settled into place immediately. A safeguard, one my husband had clearly anticipated. I folded my hands on the table, my posture composed. "Were any of those changes completed?" I asked, and she shook her head. "No. They remain pending because final authorization has not been confirmed." I allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of that answer settle fully before I spoke again. "Then I would like to formally confirm that no changes are to be processed without my direct approval," I said, each word precise, leaving no room for interpretation. She nodded again, this time with a slight sense of clarity in her expression, as if the situation had just aligned into something understandable. "Of course," she replied. "We can place an immediate hold on all pending actions and update the authorization requirements accordingly." I watched as she entered the instructions, her movements methodical, the system responding in real time, locks being placed, permissions being adjusted, a structure reasserting itself quietly but firmly. I did not feel relief, not in the way one might expect. What I felt was confirmation that what I had seen in the documents was not theoretical. It was active, it was enforceable, it existed beyond paper. When she finished, she turned the screen slightly toward me, showing the updated status. Everything paused, everything awaiting my decision. I nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, not because she had done me a favor, but because she had followed the structure exactly as it was designed. I gathered the documents back into the folder and stood, my movements unhurried, because there was no longer any need to rush. Outside, the sunlight had grown stronger, the air slightly warmer, and as I walked back to my car, I noticed how different everything felt compared to just 2 days ago. Not easier, not lighter, but aligned, because now, while they were still moving forward with assumptions, scheduling meetings, preparing listings, speaking about ownership as if it had already changed hands, the foundation beneath those actions had quietly shifted. The access they believed they had was no longer there. The authority they assumed was theirs had been placed back where it belonged, and they did not know it yet. I opened the car door and placed the folder on the seat beside me once more, but this time, it was not just a collection of documents. It was a position, one I now fully occupied, and as I started the engine, I understood that everything from this point forward would not be about proving anything. It would be about allowing them to continue just long enough to realize, on their own, that the ground they were standing on was no longer stable. By the time the afternoon settled in, everything had already begun to move exactly as I expected, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet friction that comes when something assumed meets something real. I was back in the hotel room, the folder closed on the desk, not because I had finished with it, but because I no longer needed to keep looking at it to know what it contained. My phone rested beside it, and when it rang, I did not need to check the name to understand why. I answered on the second ring, my voice steady. "Hello." And this time there was no hesitation on the other end, only urgency, controlled but unmistakable. "Mom, there is an issue," Daniel said, his tone tighter than before, the careful distance from the previous day replaced by something closer to confusion. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes resting on the stillness of the room. "What kind of issue?" I asked, not because I did not already have an idea, but because I wanted him to say it. There was a brief pause, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "The bank flagged the accounts. They said there are restrictions in place, and the realtor called this morning saying we cannot move forward with anything related to the house." I let the silence stretch for a moment, not as a tactic, but as space. Space for the reality of that statement to settle, for him to hear it fully in his own voice. "I see," I replied calmly, and that calm seemed to unsettle him more than any reaction would have. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked, and there it was, the question shifting direction. No longer certain, no longer grounded in assumption, I folded my hands loosely in my lap, my posture relaxed. I spoke with the bank this morning, I said, each word clear, each one placed without emphasis, just fact. There was another pause, shorter this time, sharper. Why would you do that? He asked. And beneath the question I could hear something else. Not anger, not yet, but the first trace of something unraveling. I turned my gaze toward the window, the light now softer as the day moved toward evening. Because my name is on those accounts. I replied simply, and I did not need to say more than that. The statement carried its own weight, its own explanation. There was a shift in his breathing, a slight break in the rhythm. That is not what we were told, he said, and this time the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that had not been there before. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of emotion, but out of clarity, because this was the point where everything they had built on assumption began to meet structure. Then you were not told everything, I said, and my voice did not change. It did not rise or fall. It remained steady, because steadiness now held more power than anything else. The silence that followed was longer, heavier, filled with the weight of realization that does not arrive all at once, but piece by piece. I could almost hear him thinking, retracing steps, replaying conversations, measuring what he had accepted against what he was now being told. Rebecca spoke to the lawyer. He said the documents were clear, Daniel added, his tone quieter, less certain, and I opened my eyes again, looking at the folder on the desk, at the truth that had always been there, waiting to be read correctly. Documents are clear when you have all of them, I said, and again, I did not elaborate. Because explanation was no longer necessary. Not yet. There was a long pause, and then, almost reluctantly, what happens now? He asked, and that question, more than anything else, told me that the shift had begun, not complete, not resolved, but started. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the arms of the chair. Now, I said, my tone unchanged. Everything is reviewed properly. I let the words settle. Simple, direct, without confrontation, without accusation, just direction. He did not respond immediately, and when he did, it was quieter than before. Okay, he said, and this time it sounded less like acknowledgement and more like acceptance. We ended the call shortly after, and I set the phone down beside the folder, my hand resting there for a moment, because what had just happened was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it was definitive. The version of events they had been operating under was no longer intact. The path they had been moving along had narrowed, redirected, brought back into alignment with something they could no longer ignore. I stood up and walked to the window once more, looking out at the parking lot, at the steady movement of cars, and people who had no idea that somewhere, quietly, a structure had just been restored to its rightful form. I did not feel the need to call Rebecca. I did not feel the need to explain anything further, because explanations would come in the proper setting, through the proper channels, where clarity would not be dismissed or reshaped. I returned to the desk and placed my hand lightly on the folder, not as a gesture of possession, but as acknowledgement, because everything they had tried to move without me had now come to a stop, not by force, not by confrontation, but by the simple act of placing the truth back where it belonged. And as the room grew quieter, the light fading slowly into evening, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something they had not prepared for, a process they could not control, and a reality they would now have to face, one document at a time.